I'm sure most of you are familiar with the prosaic statement, "Let's agree to disagree." This phrase emerges again and again in American society when moral dilemmas, religious dogmas, or political opinions find their way into conversations. People will end the discussion by saying, "What's true for you is not true for me." And this is what relativism is all about, the belief that truth and everything associated with it differs from person to person. Moral relativism is a major branch of relativism, and it basically argues that people's moral principles merely reflect individual worldviews, and as a consequence, morality differs from individual to individual. But only a fool would embrace such a worldview, because this philosophy is merely a paradise for both the ignorant and the cowardly, a paradise for the 75% of Americans who believe that morality is indeed relative. Why? Because for the ignorant, it fools all of them into believing that all cultural and moral propositions possess equal and veritable value, when in reality, they don't at all. In fact, the whole philosophy rests on a logical fallacy. It violates the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction states that something cannot be what is and not be what is in the same time and in the same sense. Simply put, two contradictory truths cannot be true at the same time. For instance, when discussing the origins of life, some people believe in the process of evolution, while others argue that a transcendent God created our universe. But can both of these beliefs be true at the same time? Can we say that evolution is true for one person and that God is true for another? Of course we can't. In the end, there is one cause for the creation of our world, and this cause is the same for everyone, regardless of what they choose to believe. But this is not what relativists believe. Relativists believe that morality is all relative, and that is simply outrageous. So, moral relativism, it would all be okay if this philosophy remained tucked away in the hands of both the ignorant and the cowardly. Unfortunately, moral relativism has decided to spread like an uncontrollable virus and has reared its ugly head in the U.S. legal code. But before we analyze the impact moral relativism has had on our legal code, let's go back and see where it all originated from. It all began with ancient Greek philosopher Protagoras. He was the first person to realize that perception usually supersedes reality. And indeed, it does. For instance, if your friend were to accidentally take something from you, you might feel angry and perceive that he's a thief. Now, your friend probably didn't mean to take your possession, but what you perceive as stealing, your friend perceives as an accident. And this leaves you with two distinct, yet equally veritable realities. And you're both right. At least that's what Protagoras would say. After much thought and observation, he finally concluded that human knowledge usually finds its limits in perception, and as a consequence, that man is the measure of all things. Of course, psychological findings further enhance Protagoras' theory by arguing that a person's culture and their environment shapes the way they think. Consequently, their perception of the world depends on the environment in which they grow up in, their culture, their familial upbringing, the social norms of their environment. All these different factors determine their perception of the world. The typical victim approach. In that moment, philosophy and psychology gave birth to moral relativism. Unfortunately, they also gave birth to the most inconceivable forms of evil. You see, like I said before, moral relativists argue that what person A perceives as moral may differ from what person B perceives as moral. And this leaves us with a world in which all humans have different interpretations of goodness. So, is there evil in this world? ISIS is killing thousands of innocent people. But is there anything wrong with that? I asked those same two questions to my aunt, who proudly calls herself a moral relativist. And you know what she said? Oh, no. What ISIS is doing is wrong. What they're doing is evil. That's different. But what's different about it? ISIS perceives its behavior as acceptable. So, from a moral relativistic point of view, what they're doing is perfectly fine. See, this is where the hypocrisy of it all lies. Moral relativists do not hesitate to banish absolute truth out the front window. But when murder or crass violations of the law enter the scene, they will rush to let absolute truth back in through the back window. But who are they to condemn the behavior of ISIS? Who are they to decry violations of the law? Because to label an action as evil or immoral is to promote an absolute statement. Although 75% of Americans call themselves relativists, 58% argue that a person who commits murder should receive the death penalty. Why? Well, probably because they believe that murder is wrong. But saying that murder is wrong is a moral absolute. If people want to classify themselves as relativists, then they must accept that all things become permissible. Lying, cheating, murder, cannibalism, slavery, or whatever you may like to call evil. Now, these are the problems contained in the philosophy itself. But now, let's zoom in and analyze the legal toll of relativism. At first glance, relativism would lead to a surfeit of problems because the US legal code does indeed promote absolute standards of behavior. It declares that murder is wrong. That is an absolute statement. It declares that stealing is wrong. That too is a moral absolute. It declares that rape is wrong, which is also an absolute statement, and which, by the way, I think every female and male in this room would agree with. So if moral relativism was to enter the US legal code, then wouldn't American law lose its relevance over human behavior? Wouldn't we have a world full of anarchy because in the end, everyone's opinions are equally moral? Of course. The US legal system was one step ahead of that lethal philosophy. Seeing the inherent dangers of relativism, they did not allow human perception alone to dictate behavior. Instead, they have decided to become accommodating. But this has not come without a cost. A few years ago, the Michigan Supreme Court dealt with a case in which a Muslim woman refused to remove a headscarf that covered most of her face. Although the Sixth Amendment's Confrontation Clause requires all witnesses to testify openly in court, her attorney kept insisting that removing the garment would violate her Islamic moral beliefs. In the end, although her case was dismissed, this provoked public controversy because people argued that the judge had violated her right to freely express her religion. Except when two constitutional principles are at odds, the court must decide which one should be given preference. In this case, the Sixth Amendment and rules of evidence took precedence over her First Amendment rights. And understandably so. I mean, don't we have the right to accurately identify those who are testifying against us in a trial? Of course we do. So the judge might have restricted her religious expression, but had he allowed her to wear her garment for the sake of respecting her moral beliefs, he would have relegated American state law to sheer religious preference. And that is simply outrageous. But this was only the beginning. This was when relativism was still emerging in the legal system. It was just barely beginning to make itself known. It only got worse from there. This incident, and others like it, inspired minority groups all over America to voice their opinion and advocate for their First Amendment rights, cultivating what I like to call a culture of advocacy. Now, this type of advocacy is healthy for a melting pot society, but when it gets mixed with moral relativism, that's when the waters get a bit murky. Due to the rise of moral relativism, people have falsely assumed that a multiplicity of cultures is tantamount to a multiplicity of truths. As a result, the U.S. legal code has made countless of fruitless attempts to equally represent all cultural propositions. Except the term equally entails considerable limitations because it implies that the legal system must represent all cultural viewpoints even if their respective values clash with one another. For instance, Asian values do not derive themselves from the individualistic idea of human rights, but rather emphasize heavily on collective duties. They prioritize the community over the individual, social rights over civil rights, and they believe that a successful country is contingent on a capable government that can provide stability. This is seen in the continuation of Lee Kuan Yew's leadership here in Singapore. And although he did bring economic prosperity to Singapore and aided the country's development, in America's eyes, this would be seen as a violation of democratic values. However, to equally represent all cultural views means to equally represent both the American view of life and the Asian view of life. And this places the legal system in between two walls. What do they do? How are they supposed to represent two opposing perspectives? It's simply impractical. So, we shouldn't be surprised that the U.S. legal system has suffered from trying to equally represent all cultural and moral propositions. In August of 2010, Joseph Charles, who is a family court judge residing in New York City, declared a Muslim man innocent, even though he had admitted to the rape of his wife. Now, rape does violate a constitutional amendment, but the judge justified his verdict by referring to Islamic law, which requires all women to submit to their husband's will. So therefore, the judge exercised moral tolerance and dismissed the woman's trauma. Established U.S. laws clash with Islamic values, but for the sake of being a moral relativist and being inclusive of all cultures, the judge viewed rape and treated rape as an acceptable form of behavior. And this is where relativists make yet another mistake. They falsely assume that exercising tolerance means treating all cultural views of morality as equal. But that is far from true. As a supporter of absolute truth, I also believe that we must tolerate different cultural views and different moral views. But exercising tolerance does not mean that we have to equally represent all moral opinions. When we tolerate something, it means we accept it and we deal with it, even though we may not necessarily agree with it. So if we were to tolerate, let's say, cheating, it means we would endure it, but not necessarily condone it. But we must ask ourselves, why wouldn't we condone it? Well, probably because we think that murder is wrong. Now, probably because we think that cheating is wrong. Now, cheating is wrong is a moral absolute. So if you really dig deep, you'll notice that tolerance does presuppose an objective moral truth that stands in relation to all other moral principles. While being tolerant does not mean that one has to be a relativist, being a relativist does mean that one has to be tolerant. But, unfortunately, being a relativist means embracing values that may diametrically oppose America's own principles. And this is a major problem that the U.S. has been facing. However, it is important to note that this is not to say that the U.S. legal code must be exclusive and not include other cultures. All this means is that the U.S. legal code simply cannot do what it's doing now. Try to equally represent all moral views. It's simply nonsense, especially considering that American law is based on moral absolutes. Different cultures can practice their own religion, they can wear their own traditional clothing, they can speak their own languages. But when they're in America, they must conform to American law and American standards of behavior in the same way that Americans conform to Singaporean standards. I'm sure most of you have heard about the Michael Fay incident. In 1994, 18-year-old Michael Fay confessed to having committed the crime of theft. The Singapore government therefore said that he was going to receive 4 months in prison and a caning. Now, the U.S. protested this sentence and said that it was too extreme for a teenager who hadn't committed a violent crime. However, Singapore upheld its laws and carried out the sentence. Unlike the U.S., Singapore did not fall victim to the relativistic influence. Even though Fay was an American, in the legal context, Singaporean values were superior to his own. And finally, as members of SAS, we live in an international community that overflows with diversity. And with diversity, all this diversity, different opinions and different cultural opinions and views of morality are bound to arise. Although we must tolerate and try to understand these opinions, we must acknowledge the existence of absolutes. In fact, even in SAS, we promote moral absolutes. Raise your hand if you would say that cheating is wrong. How many of you would say that bullying is wrong? Well, if everyone who raised their hand either consciously or unconsciously promoted a moral absolute. If we were to embrace moral relativism, if we were to say that morality differs from individual to individual, we could say that cheating is sometimes right and not wrong. We could say that bullying is sometimes justified by the particulars of a circumstance. It would all become relative. And most importantly, we represent the future generations of lawmakers and judges. And in order to avoid making the same mistakes as this current generation, we must break the relativistic chokehold on the US legal system. The next time you find yourself saying, let's agree to disagree, really think about the legal and the personal implications of what you're saying. The next time you say this, imagine this. If someone were to kill an infant in the middle of this auditorium, would you deem this behavior as acceptable? Maybe killing the infant was not bad to the killer. Or maybe he grew up in an environment that was devoid of kindness and mercy. And therefore, his environment shaped the way he thought and consequently made him think that killing this infant was not really a bad thing to do. So shouldn't we, by embracing moral relativism, look over his crime and declare the offender innocent? After all, he is a victim of his own circumstances, so his crime shouldn't warrant what is normally due to him. You see, this is why we need to break a barrier. Right now, only 6% of American adults claim to support moral absolutes, which means that an overwhelming majority of Americans have been seduced by this lethal philosophy. But, as I said, this philosophy brings a surfeit of problems to the US legal system. Therefore, we need to expose relativism for what it really is, the most lethal, illogical, and seductive philosophy that currently dominates American society. Thank you.